Well, hello there. My name is Dylan, and you saw the title of this video. You know what we're doing. We're doing a little drone footage color grading. We're also going to be doing a bit of color correction because some of these shots certainly need it. Let's start with this shot. This is a nice little FPV shot through this little archway here. Something to note right off the gate, it appears as if we have no detail in the very darkest parts of our shot. And we can verify that by bringing up our handy scopes. So press Command 7. That is your shortcut to bring up your video scopes. And the scope you want to bring up is the Luma Waveform. So if perhaps you have your vector scope up, you're going to want to switch to Waveform. That's going to bring up a whole new set of options, and then you just click Luma. This measures brightness. And as you can see, our trace is sitting below the 0 IRE line. This means that we are essentially erasing detail in the very darkest parts of our image. The issue with this shot is there's no way to get this detail back, and I'll show you what I mean here. So if we go to our shadows exposure slider and bring up the brightness or the exposure of our shadows to about 0 or even greater than 0, you'll notice that this detail is not coming back. Unfortunately, it was lost either in the post-processing process or it was lost in camera. And because we don't have access to the log clip, we're just going to have to make do. So what I would suggest doing if you have footage that looks like this, instead of using your color wheels, let's go ahead and bring up the color curves, which is a favorite of mine. So what I want to do here, I want to be able to add contrast to the shot while bringing up these shadows a bit more. So what I'm going to do is make a point in our shadows here. If you don't know how the Luma curve works, you have your shadows towards the bottom, midtones in the middle, highlights at the very top end. I'm going to make a point in our shadows. I'm going to lift our blacks here just so it's sitting right about 0. Now you'll notice that does lift. It doesn't bring much detail back, but it does look a bit better. Now if we go too high, it's looking milky, and we don't want to see that. We just have it in a good range above 0, and then you can go in if you want to add contrast. Notice how this isn't dropping our brightness of our shadows past 0 anymore. So we can just lower this. I think I want to add a bit more contrast. That looks pretty solid. So we're sitting above 0. Maybe bring this down a little bit. Right there, scrub through. Good. Okay, so we're not going below 0 anymore. We're not erasing any more detail than we need to be. Perhaps we add a little bit of brightness into our upper midtones and our highlights. So we're going to make a point here and push up. Now this is going to create somewhat of a what's called a bleach bypass look. You notice if I really crank this, this is the type of grade that they use in war films, Saving Private Ryan, etc., stuff like that. And we don't want that. We want this to look pretty natural, but have a stylized grade. So just a small push up back towards where it started, which is this center line. Let's scrub through and take a look. That looks pretty good. I think I would like to make an adjustment later on that's going to tweak the contrast a bit more, but we'll leave it here for now. Let's bring up a color wheels, and I just want to pump in some saturation. So go to your global saturation slider. We'll just increase this. And because we don't have to worry about skin tones, about pumping in too much saturation into skin, we can really crank this. Not too much. If we go bring up our vector scope, we take a look. We want to make sure that this scope, this trace here is not extending out. If you connected all of these little quadrants, if you had an imaginary line that connected all of these, we really don't want to get that close to that imaginary line, and we definitely don't want to have it extend past that imaginary line. So let's bring it down. I think something right about there. For drone nature shots, I want a lot of saturation, but I don't want it to be too much. Let's bring up another color curves here. And I think what I would like to do is add a bit of warmth into our highlights. It already is sitting pretty warm, but I would like to give the viewer more of a feel like it's very warm weather, it's inviting, and so we don't want to make it bleak and cold. So I'm going to go to our highlights, and by the way, I kind of skipped past that. If I don't explain everything I'm doing, I apologize. I'll try to explain everything while kind of keeping a quick pace. So hit this drop-down menu on your curves, and you can select any hue you want. So let's select orange. And all we're going to do is make a point in our upper midtones and our highlights and add some of that warmth, some of that orange into the very brightest parts of our image. Now you'll notice right in here, if I bring this up and down, You don't want to do too much because that's making this look terrible, but we can adjust that in a bit. So just push in some warmth, and then we're going to add a little bit of color contrast here. So we're going to go to the very bottom of our curve, which adjusts our lower midtones and our shadows, and we're going to pull down. So this is going to decrease the amount of orange, specifically in the darkest parts of our shot, and that's going to add the complementary color of orange, which is cyan. And so you'll notice as I drop this down, if you look in the very darkest parts of, especially in this rock, that it's adding a bit of that, that blue. So let's drop it down just a bit more, and let's make some final tweaks to this shot. So let's bring up a hue saturation curves panel. And first, let's go to our hue versus hue curve. So the hue versus hue curve lets you adjust the color of any color you want. So we can go in, select the picker. We can try and select the rock and maybe push it more towards orange and see how that looks. You'll see now it's swinging a little bit towards yellow. It's orange. Who am I kidding? But we can see how that would look. Maybe just a little bit. And that's given us more of a complementary look here, but it doesn't look unnatural. And then something I want to try is just selecting our sky and seeing if we can make a small adjustment to our blue, just a tiny push, perhaps to get a different look. So let's see what that did. So very minute, but you can see on the vector scope that this did make an adjustment. You look in the sky as well as the orange of the rock. It did shift it. And then let's hop down to the Luma versus Sat curve. So this allows you to adjust the intensity of color, the saturation, in different brightness values. So this is particularly useful if you go about pushing your colors a bunch in your shot. If you create a grade that is quite stylized, this will come in handy. I don't know that we went about pushing our colors that much, but we can give it a shot here. So I'm going to select the very darkest parts of our shot, which is mainly in this rock. And we're just going to drop this down. This is allowing us to decrease the saturation or the intensity of color in those very dark areas. And I just want it to be a gradual drop off. If we go into this little area right here and we turn this off and on, look, notice right in here. You see what's going on right here? This is before, right? And this is after. So it's really cleaning up our shadows quite a lot, more than I had anticipated, actually. And we could probably even check it right about here. Let's turn this off and on. Not as much. You can kind of see it, but it's a very minimal adjustment here. And let's see if we can go about adjusting our highlights. I kind of like this very warm, bright highlights, but we can see if we can make it a little bit more natural looking by dropping the saturation of the very brightest part of our image, and that's going to get some of that white back, which does make it look more natural. Now, I'm not dropping it down fully. I still want a lot of that warmth. But so if I turn this off and on, just look in this area. So that's off, on, off, on, and that just cleans it up so much. And something I just noticed is if you look in the shadow of this rock on the water, if I turn this off and on, look how much that cleans up the shadow in the water. Off, on, off, on, tremendously. And then the final thing we'll do for this shot is go to our Sat versus Sat curve. This curve lets you adjust the intensity of color in different saturation levels. So this can be particularly useful if you have a shot that has parts of the image that are really saturated and parts of the image that are not that saturated, and you want to balance out those saturation levels and make it look cleaner and more professional. So I greatly dislike how overly saturated the orange is on this rock. So this will adjust that. So if you go to your Sat versus Sat curve, the very right of this curve is the most saturated areas in your shot. The very left is the least saturated areas. So if we go to this right point here and we drop this down, you'll notice it's taking out the saturation in the most saturated areas. Now that looks pretty good, actually. I'm not sure I even want to increase the saturation of the least saturated areas, maybe a little bit. Perhaps something right about there. So now we have a rock face that looks, maybe a little bit less, actually. Let's bring this up. Okay, something right about there. So here's the shot that we have. I think looks real good. Is warm and inviting, has fairly high contrast. We're not removing detail from our highlights at all. We're not removing detail from our shadows. We're sitting at a good level. to me, that's a solid grade, and I would call it there. Perhaps I would let my eyes rest on the shot, come back at a later time and see if I do like this color grade. But for now, let's leave this. Shot number 2, we have this road that's going through a lake, I think, and we're going to go about first adding contrast because it does not have a lot of pop to it, and we can notice that on the Luma waveform. The dynamic range, or the distance between the very darkest point and the very brightest point, other than the car here, it's not very wide. It's not very far apart. And so to give your shot more pop, more contrast, you really want to expand your trace out. And because the Luma waveform measures brightness, it lets us know how much to go about adjusting it. So with your color wheels up, you could also use your color board. I just prefer the color wheels. Let's go to our shadows exposure slider and let's drop our shadows down till it's closer to 0 IRE. Now, if you remember from the last shot that we graded, if we go below 0, we're now erasing detail in the very darkest areas of our shot. If you don't notice that you're going below 0, a little trick that you can use is by going to View, go down to Range Check and switching this to Luma. It'll show you what areas you have now essentially erased detail on. So we have erased detail in these trees, a little bit in the water, and so let's go about fixing that. So let's bring up our exposure a bit more. Now, I don't really care if we crush detail in this area in here because it's already dark as is, and I want a bit of contrast. So these little sparkles that are showing up for the range check, don't worry about it. Let's leave that. I'm going to turn this off for now. Where we're going to get a lot of our contrast is in our midtones. So with our midtones exposure slider, let's drop this down a little bit. Now, an issue here, because we could raise the brightness of our highlights and expand our dynamic range, but notice what's going on with our shot. What is incorrect about it? We are now blowing out our highlights. We are erasing detail in those cars, and that's no bueno. That's one sure way to notice an amateur video editor is blowing out highlights and ugly looking color grades. So let's not do that. Let's try and make this as professional as possible. So we're going to want to leave the highlights with the color wheels right here. The color wheels make big gradual adjustments to your shot. For example, if I move the exposure of our highlights, just notice how that is just stretching the entire image, starting from the highlights all the way down to the shadows. So to add a bit more contrast, we're not going to adjust our color wheels. Instead, let's bring up color curves, and we are going to go to our midtones, upper midtones and highlights, and we're going to create a slight S curve here. And notice how in our two cars, we're not going above 0. Now, if we take the very brightest point here and push this up, now we're erasing detail, just like we were with the highlights. But we keep this anchored to this top point. It keeps it locked in, and we're going to push this up just to add more contrast. This is brightening up our highlights and upper midtones, as well as lower midtones, a bit of our shadows. But what we're going to do here is create what's called an S curve. So we're going to go down to our shadows and drop this down. This is lowering the brightness of our shadows even more. So if we turn this off and on, what we've done so far, we went from this to this. Perhaps this is too moody for you. If it is, just decrease the amount of contrast you added. You can also go down to the mix down here and just decrease this, and that's going to take away whatever adjustments you made in here. But since we're in the color wheels, let's add some saturation back in. Maybe I'll just bring up our midtones just a little bit, right about there. Okay. So we have our contrast and saturation. I would like to go in and start creating more of a look. So let's bring up hue sat curves. I want to see if we can go about adjusting the color of any color we want. And I would like to see if we can adjust the green of this lake and just see if we can tweak it a bit more right there. Look at that. I mean, that just looks so much better. It was this kind of gross green, and now it matches this side. Now, this is more of color grading because you're making the shot look unnatural to how it would actually look if you're there. Whereas color correction is making your shot look as natural as possible, which is kind of what we're going to do with this shot here. We're going to pretend this is a real estate drone shot, and we're going to make this look as natural as possible to what it would look like if we were there at this location. But for this, we're going to do a bit of a stylized look. So we've adjusted our water. Let's go in and make a few more adjustments. Let's use our hue versus Luma curve, and you want to be very delicate with this curve because you can really tear apart your image if you make big adjustments to it. So this lets you adjust the brightness of different colors. Now, you'll see what I mean here. If I go in and increase the brightness in our greens, tears apart our image. But if we use it sparingly, just a little push, you can either brighten or not that much, or dim that green. Now, I think I want to just brighten it just a little bit, not much at all. I want it to just give these trees a little pop. Look at that blue. That really helped us out quite a lot. Made that water look so much better. So we could call it quits if you wanted something that was natural and high contrast. So this is before and this is after. If we go through our steps here, we have our contrast and saturation. We have a little bit more fine-tuned contrast, and we have an adjustment of this side of the lake or river. I'm not really sure. And if you wanted to create more of a look, you could bring up your color curves, maybe add a bit of warmth, maybe a bit of red into your upper midtones, just pushing a little bit. Maybe I'll drop this down a small amount. It totally depends on what you're grading this for. If you're grading it for a film, a documentary, YouTube video, it's all going to be different, as well as the wants and needs of your client or whoever is guiding the project. All right, let's move on to this shot that we're going to try and make as natural as possible. We're just going to do some color correction and pretend that this is perhaps a shot to sell one of these houses. So with real estate drone footage, you want to make sure you have a decent amount of contrast. You really want your image to pop. You want it to be inviting, particularly not bleak and cold. This shot has a more cool tones than I would like, considering it's in such a warm, tropical-looking climate. So let's go about adjusting that. So first things first, let's use our color wheels to add more contrast by increasing our dynamic range. So we'll go to our shadows exposure slider. Let's drop our shadows down closer to 0 IRE, and let's raise our highlights up, really stretching our shot, giving our shot more pop. Now, these houses in some of the darker areas are already sitting a little bit too low for me to want to adjust the exposure of the midtones. And if you remember what I mentioned, these make big adjustments to your shot. So it's one of the reasons why I'm considering not using the midtones exposure slider, instead using the Luma curve. But for now, let's just add in some of our saturation. And now let's go to our Luma curve. So let's bring up color curves. Let's go to our lower midtones and just drop this down. Something right about there. Maybe just give a little bit of pop in our upper midtones and our highlights. So we have added our contrast and saturation. Now we need to color balance the shot. I am noticing kind of a greenish teal tinge to the overall shot that would be okay if we were grading this for a film, maybe a documentary, perhaps a YouTube video, but we are making this, we're grading this for a fake real estate video, and we want to make this look as natural as possible. If you can't tell whether your shot has a tinge to it, a color cast to it, an improper color balance, no worries. Over time, you will gain a better eye. I would highly suggest using your scopes. Usually, you can use your vector scope if someone's in your shot, and you can identify whether their skin is on the skin tone line. However, with drone shots, usually we don't have people that we can use to balance our shot. So we're going to need to use a scope like our RGB Parade. This is a great scope to use to identify whether there's an imbalance in your shot. There's a lot to this scope, but generally you want these three channels to be sitting closer together. Not always. For example, if you have a shot of a sunset, there's going to be an elevated red channel and your blue channel is going to be sitting a bit lower and squished. So you don't always want to have them sitting closer together, but this is midday for the most part, and we have quite a disparity, quite an imbalance in our three channels here. So an issue that I see people, especially on YouTube, doing quite often is going to their color wheels going to their temperature and tint sliders, and then adjusting their temp and tint sliders. I highly suggest not using your temperature and tint sliders for color balancing because they don't change an incorrect black point. So if your entire shot is, say, too blue, it will affect the highlights and midtones and not adjust those very dark parts. So that's why I would use the global hue slider and try and get your black point, very bottom part here, as close together as possible. So something right about there. And then we can go to our highlights, our highlight hue slider here, and get these sitting a little bit closer together. And already that's looking a lot better. I think we park it right about here for now. Now we still need to do a bit of work here. You'll notice our colors are clipping. It's probably in these orange areas, but we can adjust that in secondary corrections. And I know we want to make this as natural as possible, but we also want to make it inviting to potential homeowners that are looking at this real estate video. So I want to adjust the color of the water just a tiny bit, just a small push. And perhaps we raise this. A very, very small push. So if I turn this off and on, just a small adjustment, making it more cyan. Now let's take care of this clipping that we're seeing in some of these orange areas. So we can take our dropper here. I assume it's coming from these houses, especially right here. Look at that. Look how high that point is. It's coming from this little house on the corner. So the hue versus sat curve adjusts the intensity of color in different colors. So by selecting the picker on this orange roof, we can decrease the intensity of color in the very brightest parts of, I'm sorry, not the brightest parts, in that color that we're selecting, which is the orange. Notice how if I turn this off and on, that is taking away the clipping that we're seeing. There is still some clipping that we're seeing, but if we drop this down even more, it's just gonna suck out that saturation completely. So let's leave this. I also wanna see how it would look if we adjusted the color of this grass. This grass is just looking a little dismal. And because we want this to be more inviting, let's make it greener, huh? So I'm just using the hue versus hue curve. Let's just change the color of any color we want. And we're dropping down the greenish yellow curve, making sure this isn't, a tight selection. We want it to be broader so that it doesn't break apart our colors. Let's hop down to the Luma versus sat curve. I want to take out some of this blue that's in the darkest part of our shot here. So we're going to adjust the intensity of color in those very dark areas. This is going to really clean up these really dark areas here. And let's add some more saturation into our grass. Okay, I think I want to make one final tweak that I'm noticing here. I feel like the shot is a bit too cool. And so this is an instance when you have the shot color corrected where you can now use the temperature and tint sliders because now you have the black point sitting at a decent level. So you can go in and increase the warmth in your shot with the temperature and tint sliders. And that looks quite a bit better. And let's just add a tiny magenta shift just by pushing to the right. You know what? I'm going all in. Let's make it quite a bit warmer. We want it to be even more inviting. So here is the shot that we have color corrected and graded. It's looking pretty good. Let's look at where we started from. We added contrast and saturation, a little bit more contrast. We went in and adjusted the color balance of our shot. We made some specific tweaks, some secondary corrections to the shot, and then we added the final touch, making the shot warmer. So we went from this to this. Quite a big difference. Not bad. It could probably use more work, but we have some other clips to get on with. This shot needs quite a lot of work. I'm going to run through this real quick because this clearly has already been color graded, or at least attempted to be color graded, and it's looking bad. So let me just go in and adjust our contrast and saturation. We'll just bump this up, adjusting our contrast by hopping in a Luma curve, increasing our upper midtones and our highlights. So we're raising the brightness in those areas. And our blacks are looking a little bit milky. Let's drop down our shadows and then our black point just a tad more. Go to our hue sat curve, go to our hue versus hue curve, and let's just adjust this because that is not a natural looking cliffside. I think that's probably natural. Go to hue versus hue. Maybe we'll adjust the hue of this to be a more cyan, perhaps. Decrease the saturation of this orange. Increase the blue of the water. And because we are adding more saturation into the blue, it's affecting areas that for sure don't need more saturation. So we can go to our Luma versus Sat here. We'll take out the saturation in the very darkest parts of our shot, and that really is cleaning up our saturation levels in the very darkest parts here. So, I mean, just within a few minutes, we went from this to this. Quite a large difference. We have this final bird's eye shot of a beach, and step one, we need to expand our dynamic range. It's too flat. So let's add some pop back into the image by lowering the brightness of our shadows. By using our shadows exposure slider here, we'll drop this down closer to 0 IRE, not too much, maybe right about there. And let's expand our highlights up, bringing it closer to 100. And we will adjust our midtones, kind of ping-ponging these back and forth. So if you bring up your midtones, you're going to have to bring down your shadows and vice versa. Now, there's a lot of grossness going on in the shot. We have way too much saturation in areas, specifically in them. They're looking pretty horrendous. So let's see if we can fix that. I actually want to bring up another color wheels, and I am just going to push our global hue slider in the direction of orange. I want to warm up the shot. We'll focus on them later. I mean, they're just destroyed. But for now, let's just work on warming up the shot, because this is a beach. So it shouldn't be looking like this. It's so dang cool. So let's add some orange back in. That's given a lot of that warmth to the sand, which is nice. And we can leave it right here, I think. Let's bring up a hue saturation curves, and let's go about adjusting the colors in this top-down shot. So let's start with them. We need to adjust just them and not the beach. And this is going to prove to be difficult because they are a very similar color to the sand. So by adjusting our hue versus sat curve here, we're also adjusting... Oh, we didn't even select them there. That's crazy. Let's try zooming in, selecting just them with the picker. Okay. And then dropping this down. See how it affects the beach as well? So this is an instance where perhaps you would want to use a color mask. A color mask you can select by going to this menu here, adding a color mask. You could zoom in if you'd like, select these people, and this essentially is just selecting them. It's just masking them out. So we can zoom back out just to double check, maybe 150%. Okay, we're selecting too much. You notice that? The white is what we're selecting, so we're also selecting the beach. Okay, that's better. That's much better. So now we have a little bit of the beach. We can go about trying to tweak this. We're going to get a lot of it actually in saturation. So if we move this, there it is. We can just select them and then get a better selection of their bodies by making this adjustment. Okay, we have them selected, we have them masked out, but the issue is this shot is so messed up and these colors were so clipped upon exporting whenever whoever created this grade and stuff that they're somewhat unrecoverable. We can do our best, but you'll notice if we go into hue versus sat curve, and we don't even need to make any adjustments points on this curve, because we have just them selected, we can use the global slider here, but there just is no getting back healthy looking skin. We can kind of maybe make tweaks right about, I mean, I don't know. I just don't know how we can get them looking better. Maybe a small adjustment, Luma versus Sat. No, there's just, it's clipped. The colors are clipped. And so we don't have detail in a lot of those areas. Like, look at this before and after. So we're limited to what the shot gave us. And I think this is going to be the best we're going to get, which makes me a little sad. But if we zoom back out, it's not that noticeable. They're very tiny, and we're going to have to deal with that and just let that be. That's on whoever exported out their grade. So let's add another HueSat curve. Go to our hue versus hue. See if we can maybe adjust the color of the blue just to see what it looks like. And you can hold shift and this won't go up and down, which is kind of nice. So if you want to keep it on one plane, and then you can just shift this. I don't know. I'm not sure. I kind of just like how it is with the different colors. But if you wanted to go about just adjusting this darker blue here, you could make that adjustment and make it just a bit more uniform with the rest of that. Maybe we adjust the saturation of the sand, increase the saturation of the sand, and this is making them a little bit more saturated. We probably should have this layer be after this one. Let's put that after. There we go. We could even lower the saturation on them. Okay, and I think that's about good. I mean, it's a pretty drastic change. So we essentially went from this, we added contrast and saturation. Look at them. Look how orange they look. We color balanced the shot a bit more. We adjusted the colors of the sand and the ocean, and we fixed them as best as possible, even though the colors were clipped. So we were left with a crappy image, essentially, just no detail in their skin. If you wanted something with more contrast, you could add another color curves, make another S curve here. So drop the brightness of your shadows and lower midtones, increase the brightness of your highlights, and this is also going to take away some saturation, so you could go into a color wheels and just bump up global saturation. And so we went from this to this. Pretty large difference. If we go through these steps again, boom, 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 boom. I hope I didn't ramble. I try and go as quick as possible, as well as explaining why I'm doing what I'm doing. So if you enjoyed this, please do me a favor and let me know in the comments and hit that like button. It really helps me out. Also, if you're interested in a color grading masterclass, I released a full in-depth course on Final Cut Pro, as well as those who own the plugin Color Finale 2 Pro. So check that out. Link is in the description, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.